Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Quinn Hughes. I'm one of the editors at The Drinking Gourd. It is my immense privilege today to be joined by a very special guest, Dr. Frank Wilderson. Frank is a man who needs no introduction, but it would be inappropriate, it would be impious not to speak to his many accomplishments and accolades that he has accumulated. He has a BA from Dartmouth, a master's from Columbia, a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His memoir, Incognito, and his theoretical text, Red, White, and Black, along with his numerous essays and poems, established him as one of the most groundbreaking contemporary Black thinkers and writers. He currently holds the position of Professor of African American Studies and Drama at UC Irvine, but before working as a professor, he was everything from a stockbroker to a waiter to a member of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. Frank Wilderson is the real deal. His new book, Afro-Pessimism, is a blend of theoretical and autobiographical writing in which he speaks to all of his aforementioned occupations with the lens and the insight of a philosophical discipline pioneered by him known as Afro-Pessimism. The book is available everywhere now by Liverwhite Publishing. Frank, congratulations on the new book. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. To meet you and Quinn. I must say that my favorite people on the planet are high school, college debaters.
I'm really glad to hear that. I'm happy that we get this chance to talk like face to face. I know it's been your participation in our speaking to the debate community has been active, and so I'm really glad that we get this time to talk. So I'm very excited to get into the meat of our interview today, but I wanted to take a moment to talk about how much I enjoyed reading this book, in a large part because you're a really excellent writer, and also because the book is organized in a very compelling way. It is written as a memoir, but the narrative is the heart that drives the book. But it is told through the lens of Afro-Pessimism. And so going into the book, I have to say, I was a bit almost nervous because I didn't really know what to expect. You know, was the theory going to be heavy-handed and overwhelm the autobiographical portions of the text, or was the narrative going to act as a substitute for theory? But truly, neither is really the case. The theory acts by a lens to which to read the narrative, and that really blew me away. And I think another compelling element of this writing style is that both elements of the text complement each other. The narrative is illuminated by the theoretical insight, and the theory is made more material and fleshed out by the narrative, lending itself to a very full and robust and truly unique text. And so what I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is kind of how you came to write this book, and why did you feel that now was the moment in your life, and in the climate of Black studies as a discipline, that this was the time that this book needed to be written?
Well, I was actually, to be honest with you, I was writing purely academic monograph at the time. It was probably April or March of 2017 when it all changed. Since debater, and I know you all just pulled through critical theory tremendously. So some of you and some of your comrades in debate I've written about 3 articles which are kind of meta-theoretical interpretation of the Black Liberation Army, not in terms of their tactics, but in terms of what does it mean to be Black and insurgent in a world where most people who are insurgents are fighting against capitalism or colonialism, but a Black insurgent fighting against the world, even if they think of themselves as a Marxist-Leninist. So I was trying to interrogate that, and I thought that might become my next academic book. I was also working on a novel, and I really, to be honest with you, this book now, Afro-Pessimism, which I'm very proud of, wasn't planned. The New Press in New York called me, and they wanted a group of a collection of essays for trade publication, meaning it has to be picked at a language and thinking level for a junior in college who's riding the bus, does not have a thesaurus or a dictionary available, as opposed to where academic book is pitched at a professoriate or graduate student level. What they didn't know is that there are debaters who are juniors in college and juniors in high school who read more abstractly than most professors. Just meant the ordinary junior in college, you know. And so I thought, okay, well, this way to get more exposure and have thoughts gain a wider audience. They were so proud and they want the same thing. So I began to think about that and got an agent. And as time went on, I really just began to meld anecdotes and stories which would help illustrate some of the abstract theories of social death and gratuitous violence. And I was very fortunate to get with Liverite, where there was an editor, Bob Weil, who was about my age. I'm 64, I turned 64 in April of this year, 2020. And he turned 64, he will turn 65 in September. So we've gone through some of the same processes, same histories. But not only that, he had edited a lot of major Black intellectuals over the past 30 years, like Robin Kelly and Henry Louis Gates, Appiah. And so it was a very good connection. He was a great novel editor and a great nonfiction editor, and he knew exactly what auto theory should be. In the past 5 years, there's probably only been one auto theory book on the market, which was Maggie Nelson's Argonauts. So that's really it. He was really instrumental in supporting me to not have a subtitle for this book, to make it an emphatic one-word statement. And very few editors and very few agents understood that. They thought, well, Afro-Pessimism, one-word statement, is not going to affect with the readers. And he was old enough and savvy enough to agree with me that we could have a one word, and to remember the moment in 1978 when Edward Said came up with Orientalism, just one word. That book launched a revolution in academia, what we call today post-colonial studies. So that's part of the background.
It's very interesting hearing you talk about kind of how you came to this, to write this specific book. And I know what stood out to me, and as I'm talking to friends of mine who have read this book, it is the way that it flows. And you talk about writing a memoir or writing a novel before this, and you're writing a memoir as a core element of this book. And I'm wondering if you would be able to talk a little bit about inspiration. With theory, inspiration can look like writing with someone or applying your own thoughts to a text, but with memoir and with novel writing, inspiration can come from life, it can come from music. And so I'm wondering where you find inspiration and how you can translate that into your work.
Yes, and this is very good for you, Quinn, who you are a young writer, and some of the other people in your debate team, just generally speaking. You write through two languages at two different times. So Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, which most high school and college debaters mobilize, including my articles, is written in what we would call a provocative manner. It's meant to provoke analysis. Whereas Integro is actually meant to evoke through connecting the emotional heartstrings of the reader. And so what I wanted to do was to hold the two together, the processes of provocative, to provoke and to evoke. And in semiotics, what you have is methods of processes, rather, of signification. So if you think of Freud's topography of the mind, there's the pre-conscious interests, and then unconscious identification, then the structural position of the subject. What you learn in semiotics is that pre-conscious interests is a mode of signification called secondary process of signification. And that is 99% of the way you all win or lose debates, by returning ideas, thoughts, fantasies to relational logic. In other words, dividing concepts so that they don't mesh together into nonsense. You start off the year with, affirmative, or what's the other word, negative? Is that? Yeah. Okay. So right there, the way the question is posed to you as a debater at the very beginning of the year is posed to you through the processes of secondary processes of signification. And that's really good because it's necessary to communicate. You can't have, but secondary processes of secondary processes of signification are part of what's called the combination preconscious and conscious mind. So if it's the way you in Evanston, you're in Evanston, right?
Yeah.
It's where you in Evanston, Illinois, can understand me in Irvine, Orange County, California, because as I speak to you, I'm speaking through the logic of separation and comparison, which is to say that at a minute scale of abstraction, I'm using linguistics, other grammar, to make sure that as I speak to Quinn across the airwaves, I don't confuse subjects, predicates, nouns, verbs, that they are all separate in their proper place with sentence. The fact that I don't have to think about it simply means that the structure of grammar, which represses the nonsensical utterances that I might have, say, in a dream or with a slip of the tongue or with a joke, that keeps everything separate. So you actually hear the categories in the proper order and in their proper place. You know exactly what I'm saying. Then you come back to me with the same grammatical structure, and I know exactly what you're saying. But that's only one part of the mind, and it's also the part of the mind that is least susceptible or least alive to laughter, sorrow, tears, heartbreak, joy. The other part of it, of course, is the unconscious, and that is ruled or governed by primary processes of signification. And primary processes of signification are the way the unconscious uses the tools of the symbolic order to move the unconscious as quickly as possible to the most joyous, least painful place of conceptualization. So, for example, you are up all night and you're tired and you're studying for the SAT exam. And I'm sorry, now I'm trying to get rid of the noise in my, I hope you didn't hear that.
No worries.
My ear was on. Okay. And so your mind tells you through primary processes of signification, Quinn, what we really want to do is go to the refrigerator and get a piece of chocolate and turn on Netflix. Or in a dream, your mind says, be nice to have lunch with the Kaiser on a seaside restaurant, Washington State. And all those things can happen because the process of division, which are necessary to make communication whole and proper between two subjects, are completely annulled. And so what happens is that annoyed at annulled, that was primary process of signification coming into secondary. And so what you have is a situation in which the unconscious really just wants its fantasies and it wants its pleasures, and it uses signification to get there as quickly as possible, but it doesn't really care about a future life as a student at USC or NYU. a future life as a professor that you might be, it says, right now, I want it. It's like, and so both of those things are part of the subject. And in debate, you're really moving 99% of the time through secondary processes of signification. You have to win through division, through separation, through the argumentation of categories. And, but you see, in literature, such as poetry, poetry is the most pristine form, but also novels, you have what's called in psychoanalysis facilitation. And facilitation is a kind of language which takes both secondary processes of signification and primary processes of signification and makes them into one process. And facilitation shows the least and almost not at all in mathematical equations, and it was the most in, say, what psychoanalysts call dream work. And so those are the two poles. And so when you bring them both together, you have what's called facilitation. And concretely, facilitation then is two examples are metaphor and metonymy. And what it allows for is a kind of language process that does not scuttle relational logic. It does not scuttle division, so because it wants the reader to understand, but it brings in the emotional impact of dream work into the same sentence or same line. And that can be, if you get it right, that'd be a very powerful kind of enunciation, because the listener or the reader can both understand, cry. The listener or the reader can both understand and laugh. And so I was really alive to how do I orchestrate what in sense is called facilitation. And you've told me I did a good job, so I accept it.
When you talk about that kind of the ability to access this middle ground between primary and secondary signification, it makes me think a lot about the work of Black artists, specifically like Nina Simone, when she's writing these extremely powerful protest songs that are animated by this type of spirituality, this type of physical place that is only accessed by what you describe as primary signification, something that's deep within. And so I'm wondering if there were inspirations in either Black musicians, filmmakers, visual artists that kind of help you get to that space, or what are the tools that you're using when you're sitting down to write to really be able to access that kind of perfect moment where you find yourself in almost like a state where you can be writing consistently at that level?
That's very perceptive. You're absolutely right about that. I was fortunate to go to college from 74 to 78. Of course, reading the book, I got kicked out in 78, had to come back and finish. Technically, I went to college from 74 to 80 with 2 years of expulsion in between. But, Nina Simone used to rock up on our campuses, and there was something really, at the level of understanding, we knew the words were revolutionary, but they hit us in a gut level as inspirational. So for me, the primary person is Sarah Vaughan. And your viewers can go to a New York Times interview I did on April 5th, in which I talked about it. And I like the way in which she can draw out a word through a moan. I like the kind of gravitas, the way that she can both speak about suffering and make it beautiful at the same time. So there's you're right. There's dream work going on, and at the same time, I'm understanding what she's saying. It's because of her register, which somehow hits my register. Her words me want to write.
And I think that that is done really well in your book. I think the time that it's most salient for me is when you're writing about your childhood, and you're writing about growing up. And I think what, for myself and for readers in general, I'm drawn back to a place where, you know, I was young and I'm kind of coming into the world, and beginning to have this understanding that, you know, the people moving on the TV screen or the people talking on the radio have some type of relationship to myself, and it's not just noise. And I think that your ability to write with the perspective of yourself as an adult, but also knowing where the text is going in terms of where it's going theoretically, and setting yourself up and writing about your childhood is really done intentionally and really beautifully. And so you have a section of the book to read, and it's this scene as you as a child, with your grandmother watching the news of the footage of the riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And so I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of context to this passage and read it aloud for us.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those kind words. I'm really just astounded at the level of rigor that high school debaters in particular, and college debaters, but high school debaters, you know, and I thought to myself, wow, what were at 7, you know, it was really quite, so yeah, that's a very, very interesting passage. It was 1968, April, and Martin Luther King had been assassinated. This was, as most of your comrades know, a tumultuous year. It was like 68 is like the year that things changed. When you all read Derrida, when you read Foucault, if you read Lacan and other Levi Strauss, you know, this is the year that the engine of critical theory really takes a turn, and it takes a turn because of all the stuff that's happening in the world. Less than 12 months before Che Guevara has assassinated in Bolivia, about 3 months before this episode, the Americans have finally woken to the fact that not an invincible army. The Tet Offensive has actually moved the territorial capture of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army to just several miles outside of Saigon. That's how far south they're driven. The Joint Chiefs of Staff have next year in January of '69, somewhere in there, you know, when Nixon gets sworn in, will tell Nixon that his request to mobilize 500,000 more troops to Vietnam simply can't happen because there's revolution in the streets right now. White college students have bombed 3,000 state and corporate establishments across the country. I mean, if you could imagine what this year is like, you know, the American Indian movement was up in Minneapolis. There's urban unrest throughout the country. So it's a year very much like this year in some ways, except more overt political direction, and the powers that thought their entire edifice was about to crumble. So I am 12. It is 1968. I have been living in this all-white neighborhood in Minneapolis, Minnesota for the past 6 years, 62. And it's been hard and not fun. And my grandmother has come up from New Orleans. She's about my age, about 64 at that time. And we are watching the riots. So should I start now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
I turned 12 in April, the same day Congress passed the Fair Housing Act and some days after the murder of Martin Luther King. I watched the riots on television with my grandmother, a New Orleans Catholic who had taught second grade and at one time played piano with the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. Grandmother Jules loved all kinds of sports. Her husband, Tutu, which is number 2-2, Tutu Jules, named for his ability to strike out a batter every time the call was 2 balls and 2 strikes, turned down an invitation to join the Negro National League and worked the rails as a porter, and then as a plasterer when the Great Depression came. But he was dead in 1968. When grandmother Jules came north to visit us, she spent time with me and my father watching baseball, football, and basketball, and never hunted for antiques with my mother, her daughter. She loved pickled pig's feet and a beer called Hams, which was brewed across the river in St. Paul. The murder of Martin Luther King and the Tet Offensive changed my family relationship to radio and TV. My parents listened for my uncle's name in the nightly broadcasts of casualties. My grandmother and I watched the riots. One night, her feet shot from the easy chair and damn near knocked her beer and pig's feet off the TV dinner tray. As I steadied the table, she laughed like I'd never seen her laugh before. "Go ahead, son," she cried. I heard her say this many times over whenever Tony Oliva made a base hit or when Gail Sayers ran for a touchdown. But neither Oliva nor Sayers were on the screen. I felt her joy and laughed out loud too. A knot loosened in my chest, a phantom tumor that had been there since first grade. We were watching the riots, and my grandmother laughed my pain away. If I said that for the past 6 years I hated the vast majority of students and half the teachers at my school, I would be lying. It was never that straightforward, but it would be accurate to say that I was never at ease in their presence. And since their faces were with me even when I was not with them, it would also be true to say that I was seldom, if ever, at ease. "Go ahead, son." She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to the man on the screen. But at that moment, she and I were triangulated with the man on the screen, and I felt loved. I'd like to say the city on the screen was Cleveland. It could have been Detroit, DC, Cincinnati, Chicago, Kansas City, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Trenton, New Jersey, or Wilmington, Delaware. It could have been anywhere and everywhere. No fires were visible, but smoke plumed over ruined buildings. Skid marks scarred the street where a shirtless man with a do-rag snapped around his conch nosed a shopping cart down the boulevard. Grandmother Jules laughed like her chest was full of carbonation. I knew there and then that for me, the priesthood was dead. I was going to grow up to be a looter and make my grandma proud. Our racket roused the killjoy giants who owned the house. My mother came downstairs and told her mother not to say such things. I saw my mother in silhouette, framed the living room's sliding French doors with light from the dining room at her back. She was grateful even when she was still. She and Dad modeled in fashion shows that the Boule and the Lynx, 2 of the Black middle-class social groups to which they belonged, put on. The whole room hushed when the 2 of them came down the catwalk. Mom's friends said she looked like Daniele Luna, who took the world by storm in 1968 when she became the first Black woman to grace the cover of Vogue. And I struggled to see how the blood in my mother's light skin and slender body was the same blood that ran through my grandmother, who was short and dark, sucked juice from a neck bone and stomped the damper pedal when she played piano. At the age of 36, my mother stood in the threshold, framed by her reproach, and spoke to her 63-year-old mother as though their ages were reversed. My grandmother and I looked at her like 2 kids caught being naughty. "Don't say that, Mother. Next thing you know, he'll be saying that at school. He's wayward enough as it is." When we turned back to the television, the man with the conch, the do-rag, and the shopping cart was gone. Mom went upstairs and we went back to our antics. "Why are we mad?" I asked my grandmother as we gazed at plumes of smoke rising from the flat roofs. "Because we ain't got no jobs?" I said, giggling and looking cautiously at the French doors for signs of my mother and her citation for ain'ts. "No," grandmother replied, "it's not about jobs." "Because we ain't got no hot water?" "No, it's not about water, child." "Because we live in a ghetto?" Frankie, you're not in a ghetto, she said with a chuckle, and you're mad. How she knew that was a mystery to me, for I don't recall ever telling her what went on at school. Then on the count of three, we said, we're mad at the world. From the top of the staircase, we heard, Mother, please. It would, though, be a stretch to say that my grandmother was an Afro-pessimist. But Afro-pessimism isn't a church to pray at or a party to be voted in and out of office. Afro-pessimism is Black people at their best, mad at the world, is Black folks at their best. Afro-pessimism gives us the freedom to say out loud what we would otherwise whisper or deny, that no Blacks are in the world, but by the same token, there is no world without Blacks. The violence perpetrated against us is not a form of discrimination. It is a necessary violence, a health tonic for everyone who is not Black, an ensemble of sadistic rituals and captivity that could only happen to people who are not Black if they broke this or that law. This kind of violence can happen to a sentient being in one of two circumstances. A person has broken law, which is to say, cracked out of turn given the rules that govern, or the person is a slave, which is to say, no prerequisites are required for an act of brutality to be incurred. There is no antagonism like the antagonism between Black people and the world. This antagonism is the essence of what Orlando Patterson calls social death, or deathliness, in the words of David Marriott. It is the knowledge and experience of day-to-day events in which the world tells you you are needed as the destination for its aggressivity and renewal. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. What I love about this excerpt is the phrase, Afro-pessimism is Black people at their best. And what I like about this as a sentiment is that I feel that it undercuts the idea that Afro-pessimism is a static intellectual discipline that has been invented in the past 20 years by Black intellectuals, because I feel that this is not the case. And I think your work and the work of Saidiya Hartman and the work of others in the field has definitely saturated these sentiments and put them in a very specific context. But I feel that, to me, Afro-pessimism is a theme and a life force that animates the Black radical tradition. And it is truly Black people at our best. And so I'm wondering how you came to this phrase and what it means to you.
Well, the first thing I should say is I should take you on the road with me.
Listen, I'm available. As soon as they lift the ban, we'll go city to city, traveling show.
That would be cool. I mean, sometimes I just, that's all about y'all haters. I sometimes lack, because I do so much of this, I lack the framing narratives, which you just gave, which is really wonderful. What are you asking me to say? Where did what come from? The word Afro-pessimism, or what are you trying to ask me?
The phrase Afro-pessimism is Black people at their best.
Oh, where did it come from?
Yeah, and what does that mean to you?
Okay, so what it means to me is that you and I exist in a cartographic, which is spatial and temporal carcerality, which is to say that we're always in prison. And the hydraulics of the prison experience is going to be different for you as a high school student in a college town like Evanston, and me as a professor at a college part of Irvine, than it is for someone literally behind bars. The actual first principles of that incarceration are the same. Just the experience of someone in a sweatshop is going to be different than the experience of a middle manager or a professor in Stockholm. But the process, the first principles of capitalism was extract surplus value from the labor time of the laborer are going to be the same. So what does that mean specifically is that, coming full circle to your question, that we are never in a space and time when we can speak freely. We always have to negotiate what can the non-Black listener take. In other words, what can they take emotionally? We have to know that. So it's part of our linguistic and performative DNA. It's like we don't have to know it consciously. In fact, if we knew it consciously, then it would be clunky, like grammar. You and I have never, since we began this broadcast, said anything about grammar, but we have been deploying proper grammar all the way through, which is precisely why we're getting across to each other. And so we don't carry the structure of grammar in our minds, but we know that there are real consequences for using that. If you're signing a contract, you know, or talking to the police, right? You know, and so so you have to, one of the things about being Black is that you really have to be, from a very early age, attentive to just how much of your life you can give to the listener. This is what James Baldwin says in terms of why he stopped being friends with Norman Mailer, because every time he started talking about Black suffering, Norman Mailer, who wanted to be known as the white Negro, would translate that into something germane to his experience. And if it went beyond that, then Mailer would become irritated. And you know, there are all kinds of things that Baldwin needed from Mailer. He needed the little cabin in the back of Mailer's house on the way up against the property to write one of his novels. So what would it be like if we spoke without considering the proper grammatical construction of the rules of engagement between non-Black people in civil society, between us and non-Black people in civil society? What would that look like? And sometimes we see glimmers of it, right? We can always see it in music, especially instrumental music, but also in ballads and songs, because whatever we put through in that music, the pleasures of reception for non-Black people allow them to not be attentive to the rage or the suffering. But we can't really do that very easily in the written word or the spoken word. They're going to get it immediately, and they could become very pissed off. So, for example, I want to go out. I live in a condo, you know, on the University of California, Irvine campus. It's a housing complex for professors and staff. And when I saw the police station burning in Minneapolis, I wanted to go out in the courtyard and just jump up and down and scream. You know, I don't get to do that, okay? But when the first Gulf War starts in January of 1991, and the Navy ships off the coast of Iraq are sending guided missiles to bomb Baghdad, they get to jump up and down with joy at what's called the pleasures that CNN was talking about at that time, the pleasures of what was called 1,000 points of light. So they get to have any joy and any expression, and this is what David Marat means by the fantasies of non-Black people have objective value. And I have to be very careful. And so in the episode that you had me read, this was a moment when my grandmother did not have to be careful about expressing joy at the sight of America burning. That's Black people at their best. So Afro-Pessimism as a critical theory acknowledges those moments which would otherwise have to be police, sometimes for bad reasons and good reasons. My mother comes down to police her mother and me for what she thinks are good reasons, right? So because at that point, little Bobby Seale has been the first Black Panther murdered in Oakland. And so we're getting gunned down in the streets for uttering these things, not even for putting them into action. And I think that we're not going to get to a revolutionary praxis until we are able collectively to not take account of what our non-Black listeners can handle when we speak. Not take that into account. Simply take into account what would animate Quinn, what would animate Frank, the hell with everybody else.
Right, and I think one thing that's interesting to me in that moment is when you talk about that kind of dangerous act, that radical act of what Afro-Pessimism does is pushing that as possibility. It's interesting when you talk about instrumental music, that also kind of gets at that rage that's there, but it kind of goes almost undercover or it kind of slip past in almost an inconspicuous way. I think like the scenes of like some of the first house music parties in Chicago and in Detroit, which is a Black, music form, but now you see white kids in Europe going to raves and whatnot when it's, Black music, or jazz clubs like the Cotton Club in New York City, where it's a Black band and white people dancing to it. And I think that's really astute. And I think when you talk about language and when you talk about grammar, Afro-pessimism and theory in general is a large part a language, and it's a grammar to articulate violence. And in the book, you write about rhetoric and you write about how language shaped how you think at a young age. And specifically, I'm interested in the language used by the people who were influential to you, the language used by your grandmother, then the Black Panthers in Seattle. You talk about Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. I'm wondering how these languages of love, care, community, rage grew to shape Afro-pessimism as a discipline.
That's a good question, and I'm not sure that I would like to, what do you think about that? I haven't, I could work my way to an answer, but why don't you give it a stab?
One thing that I think about is when you talk about this idea of, Afro-pessimism allows Black folks to speak to what had only been whispered. And I think when there are these moments that kind of, for me, when I speak to my personal experience, before I had read or engaged with your work, the work of Saidiya Hartman, the work of Fred Moten, and a lot of the work of Arthur Jaffa, the filmmaker, the moments that I see on the news, or the moments that I may read in a book, or the moments that I may hear in music that get at the same themes of Afro-pessimism. Nina Simone, for example, saying, "I wish I knew how it feels to be free." And then coming to the conclusion at the end of the song, "I know how it feels to be free." These moments that we constantly are coming in contact with, I think Afro-pessimism puts a lens on, or puts a framework to, that condenses it, and it puts it in a very specific orientation that I think once it becomes condensed is shocking. But I think it's not necessarily shocking in the sense that it is being presented with something new, but rather it's shocking in the sense that it's that fear that, especially the reaction of non-Black folks, that when you describe the conference in Germany, it's not the fear that this is a completely radical or new idea, but it's the fear that that subconscious or that primary process of signification that they sit with from a very early age is real, and that other people recognize it, and that maybe they haven't been as good at putting on the act or the performance as they think they may be.
I like that answer very much.
So when you talk about narrative in the book, and because the book is so constructed in narrative, it's really interesting how the work of narrative writing interacts with how you theorize about narrative. And so when you write in the book, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but in the altercation that happens between you and your partner Stella, and the engagement in the complex that happens in Minneapolis that escalated to violence, when you talk about how this kind of reaches its climax, you say that it's hard to mold why this violence happens into narrative, because violence and narrative must have an explanation, a contingent moment that makes it make sense. But for anti-Blackness, you say that this logic bleeds out beyond its actors. It's immune to logic. And you say, quote, "It presents the rules of narrative with a crisis because we have a situation that resists retelling for the simple reason that the narrative's causal principle, a ghost in the machine we call the causal logic or because principle of the story is missing. This is how the Black story is jinked. There is no ghost in the machine. The reason that for the violence is beyond the grasp of reason. There's nothing universal about it. The only way to make it intelligible is to leave out the parts that may be only accepted by another Black person and even then discreetly." And so my question is, I'm wondering how, for you as someone who builds theory from the narrative of others, as you do with the portion about 12 Years a Slave, but also for someone who writes their own narrative in tandem with the theory, I'm wondering what it's like to engage with Black narrative as a substance that's so challenging to wrestle with, specifically when you talk about this resistance that is intrinsic to it, resistance to capital L logic, capital E explanation. And I'm wondering what that process is like for you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I really like what you've brought me back to in both in reading parts of the book as you did, but then your own framing of it, which is most important. One is about Afro-Pessimism as a critical theory is that you all know, but maybe the people looking at my readers might not know. I'm really saying, and Sadia is really saying, and Hartman is really saying, sorry, Sadia is Hartman, Jared is saying, and is that what Afro-Pessimism claims and argues is not the totality of Black experience, but is the truth of Black experience, the truth of Black life. So this is very difficult for someone other than yourself to accept and get through. But most Marxists understand that kind of logic. It's just that they're resistant to bring it over to Blackness. I mean, they actually understand that if you read Volume 1 of Capital, and you see that value is not organic, it's not real or concrete, that it is the creation of the extraction of the capitalists of what's called socially necessary labor time from a certain species of people, okay? So every person who's a worker is this species who puts in what's called socially necessary labor time to produce surplus value. And no Marxist worth his, her, their salt would say, well, that's going to be different for a sweatshop worker than a professor of Stockholm. Nor would they say that's going to be different for a worker in the Ku Klux Klan or a fascist and a worker who's part of Antifa or a communist. They say, no, regardless of what the person thinks about themselves and regardless about the lived experience of labor, this is the law that governs the truth of the paradigm. So if you then come over and you say, regardless of whether someone is Candace Owen as a Trump supporter, regardless of if someone is Quinn Hughes as a, do you have a summer job I can name off or something like that? Or?
I don't, but I get what you're getting at.
Yeah, okay, if you work at Burger King or something, or regardless if you're Frankton, there's a truth, the rules of subjugation, which is called Blackness, and that's all it is. That's all we're saying, and it really doesn't matter what the Black person thinks of themselves. It doesn't matter where they live. There's just like it doesn't matter if you are a worker in Bali or a worker in Greenland. There is the truth of the paradigmatic position, and part of the truth of the paradigmatic position of Blackness is, this is a kind of like a double negative, but the absence of the ability to make sense of violence. That is at the core, the absence of the ability to make sense of violence. And what I as a person who has trained in narratology and trained as a fiction writer with an MFA from Columbia, one of the things I was seeing is not the success of slave narratives, not the success of protest novels from the 1950s and the 1960s, even though I am beholden to those traditions, because without those writers, I couldn't be who I am. But what I'm more interested in is the failures. And what I mean by the failures, so I don't talk forever, I'll give a little anecdote. In the book, 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup keeps writing about violence, and he talks about people being whipped at night when people are, just yanked out of bed for whippings. He talks about the Epps's, so that in the evening, he can hear wails up and down that little stretch of the Mississippi River. He talks about Mary Epps and Ed Epps and the children going for a picnic, and on the way, coming to the slave quarters to yank people out of the slave quarters to do family whippings of people. He talks about the 10-year-old boy getting on his pony and making an old man walk with him through the fields while people are working so that he can whip them. And the old man must perform the labor of a Greek chorus, saying, "You are thoroughgoing boy, you are thoroughgoing," as he's whipping the very people that the old man is going to have to come back at night and sleep with and put salve on their back. And so the logic of the Marxists will say that the violence of slavery is for better productivity. And we even before 12 Years a Slave as a movie, we know from just little snippets in various parts of the first volume of Capital, when Marx is reflecting on his time as a journalist for the New York Herald in New York City, he can't get it through his head, the logic of violence against slaves, because Marx was, it's counterproductive. I mean, it doesn't, it's actually counterproductive. It makes no sense that people are not able to do the kind of work necessary to industrialize this part of the economy, given the bacchanals of violence that he sees taking place when he's in America. And so the narrative of Black writers also fails to make nonsense of that by reporting on it and not reflecting on it. And then you get the book to the movie, and the movie even worse corruption, even though there's a lot I like about the film, in which they actually have to juxtapose the inability to 500 pounds of cotton in a day with the whippings. No, the whippings produce a sense of presence and pleasure for the people who are doing it. It's part of the family integrity, the family values. It makes relationships whole and produces pleasure. It's not, and it is not contingent upon not picking enough cotton. It is not contingent upon disobeying the master. It is gratuitous. It is pre-logical, in the words of Orlando Patterson. And so what I didn't want to do is to fall into the trap of imposing the logic of contingency onto anti-political violence. But here's the end of what I have to say. The problem with that is that the structure of storytelling, or as Roland Barthes would say, the narratology of discourse requires an arc. And the arc has to make sense of the incursion. So people are excited because the settler wants their land, or lynched because they crossed the border illegally. And so narrative, before we even put anything in the story, this is why Afro-Pessimism is so disturbing the logic of debate, because debate, the question and the answer works through the narrative of contingent violence and sense making of oppression. I wanted to find a way, because I'm as seduced by narrative as anyone else. It is an important part of my life. I love good stories. Stories don't love me. So that's why I had to interrupt it with the theory. And that's why there's no denouement at the end.
That's really interesting to me. And I think especially when you talk about this impulse to contingency. And I think when it becomes, Black narrative becomes Hollywoodized to a certain degree, that is really done in a really violent way. I think when you talk about the slave woman who is forced into relations with the master, and it's because she's beautiful, right? I think that's one of the most pernicious and violent articulations that we see regularly. And so I think my question for you is, how do we engage in Black storytelling? How do we engage in Black narrative? Is there a way for us to, as an intramural, resist the impositions of these types of contingency or these logics? And how do we go about articulating Black narratives in a way that might resist that violence?
I'm struggling through the weeds, trying to find that answer just like you are, and I'm 50 years older than you, so I don't, I'm just trying. I don't really, in other words, it's like we have gauze on our eyes. We're we might be at the point of a new epistemological break, but we won't know until it's the other side, and then 50 years out. I mean, it's a very interesting question. I do think that that people like you, are doing the work. I think that in 2008, when the Towson debate team won a championship, one of the tournaments against the Harvard team, that was the first step. What we're seeing now is the blackening of national debate that is going on now for a good 10 years or so. And part of that has been that never before in debate have college or high school debaters won by refusing the question. So you all are doing that work, in other words, by saying we're not going to go affirmative or negative, we're going to say that the very question is a murderous juggernaut to Black existence, and here's how we're going to interrogate it. And that is off to the judges who allowed that to happen. I was that you're in the thick of the woods of one of the universities, Northwestern, who wanted to make that kind of intervention illegal, and then wanted to some professors there, and then want to have a whole nother debate society if you weren't going to make it illegal to interrogate the question. So, I'm bumbling through your answer because I don't have a concrete answer for that. But what I do personally is I look at my spiritual progenitors who happen to be Assata Shakur and James Baldwin. I don't mean everything they've written. I mean, like for Assata Shakur's autobiography, and for me, James Baldwin wrote a book called Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, which was a book that he wrote in 1968, which actually the kind of turning point, because it's the first novel in which in which the book itself makes an argument for makes an argument that acknowledges I won't say it celebrates. It brings into view our struggle in some way, and then later the book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, about the Atlanta child murders, in which he finally moves away from love and makes this statement that this is what America does: it kills our children. It's part of the DNA of America. And so one of the things I do is I say to myself, okay, so you've got a book like Baldwin's Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. You got a book like Asada Shakur's autobiography. You got a book like Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave. And what are the places that the book could have gone, but the writing was so afraid of that it turned back onto the sense making of what it would be like if the writer was not Black? What are those places? What are they like structurally? And how can I then go into the abyss that they were too afraid to go into? Because this is terrifying material, right? But more than likely, what happens, when I remember we started this conversation by saying both speech is always under coercion. Normally, when you're in a writing process with a book, it's the editors and the publisher who put the kibosh, a kind of open-ended non-reconciliation, the absence of, and so they make you, like, you won't publish this unless you show some way that things are going to get better. So we're just not allowed to imagine that on the page. And so I feel it's my duty to go further than they could, even if I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that. You know? And then you will come along and go further than I could.
I really appreciate that articulation. And I think a lot about the folks you referenced, specifically James Baldwin. He's got this essay, Sonny's Blues, in which he talks about, it's this fictionalized narrator talking about his brother who's a drug addict and a jazz player. And in the end, and they'd always had this tension between them because the narrator is like a school teacher and he's lived kind of a straight path with his family. But he goes and he sees Sonny play, and he talks about going to the jazz club and being washed in water when he's listening to this music, going deeper into the water. And I think that for me is evidence that this space exists, this acknowledgement that this space exists. And I think when you talk about this redemptive arc, the radicalness of the ability to speak to that there is a space of what you describe as the abyss. I'd like to circle back to when you're talking about the Epps family in 12 Years a Slave, and when you talk about these moments of familial pleasure. Solomon Northup, there's a quote in the book, "The family is in their pleasure." And when you talk about this gratuitous violence and pleasure as entangled with one another, it's the term that you use in the book is to describe it as jouissance. And so I'm wondering if you'd be able to speak a bit to first how jouissance operates in these scenes, but I'm really, really curious to hear how you talk about why jouissance and violence are necessary familial fixtures to whiteness and civil society.
We're gonna work today, huh? Oh boy. Yeah, I should have known when I signed up with the debater. I'm giving you a backhanded cap. But okay, so the first point is that I asked your comrades to do a little more work on this. There's a tiny little book called Lacan, L-A-C-A-N. That's all it's titled, and the writer is Bailey, B-A-I-L-E-Y. Okay, and it's also an audiobook because whenever I do the psychoanalytic stuff, I've got to kind of go back, and so some of the things that I'm going to say are not completely fleshed out. Part of the problem with the word jouissance is that it's a French word that doesn't fully translate into English. And it's a mode of pleasure from the unconscious, but what feels it in the body. But English translations typically translate as enjoyment. But in French, it kind of means that, but it's a much more nuanced, but it also has a jurisprudential meaning, so that when you put the two together, it blends into the enjoyment of one's property. I mean, really, really crude, because part of why I want people to go to that book is you have to understand how an English language translation, what sense it makes of that word, what sense Lacan makes of that word, and then what does the word really mean in French in terms of jurisprudential meaning as well as psychoanalytic meaning. So, let's, for simplicity's sake, talk about it, the pleasure of the unconscious, and then bring in what Lacan means from, because he's borrowing from legal statutes also, that it's a propertied enjoyment. So this is part of the argument, and I would encourage your comrades to read more of David Marriott also, because where Black people exist in a kind of day-to-day life, you're a student, I'm a professor, you're a debater, I go to the gym, whatever. That's how we talk about ourselves. But where we exist in the collective unconscious, we exist as properties for the fulfillment of enjoyment. And so I've kind of lost something. Help me out, Quinn, to come back to your question.
The why joy science is a constitutive element of the white familial relationship, and whiteness as an ontological entity.
What in chapter 6 of Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon makes the argument that the Black imago resolves, is an image, so a property image that is available to resolve all the conflicts of white filiation. And what he means by that is that living in a nuclear family has a kind of oppressive hydraulics, and a better word would be repressive hydraulics, because we don't want to think too negatively about the hydraulics, because repression used in political circles is a bad thing. But repression used psychoanalytically is simply a necessary thing to allow the subject to have a relation with other subjects. And so you and I have been experiencing for the past hour and 15 minutes the most intense form of repression, because we have not allowed ourselves to let speech slip into primary processes of signification. So grammar is a major, major repressive apparatus. There's a word that I have trouble pronouncing, contiguity, which is the rules of engagement in a family. Who can marry whom? Some cultures, you can marry a second cousin. Some cultures, like the royalty of Russia, Germany, and England, up into the first 30 years of 20th century, you could marry first cousins. I mean, you had to do that so that royal blood stayed around, So there are rules about what you can do, who you can have sex with, who you can marry, what are the rules of power sharing within the nuclear family. And just like what you can do with a verb, what you can do with a noun, what you can do with a predicate, have the rules. And so these are all repressive apparati which allow for communal existence. That's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing that allows for communal existence. But it also puts anxiety into the unconscious modes of processes of signification, because unconscious processes of signification want to do what they want to do when they want to do it. So if you couple all of what I'm saying, because I just made a generic argument, and now you bring in politics and power, and you come circle back to Fanon's chapter 6, where you have a naturally occurring apparatus of repression called the nuclear family, or any family. But in that naturally occurring apparatus of repression, you have a situation in which there's a heavy power imbalance. So that the name of the father, the patriarch, has most legitimacy, the least, the daughter, the least, and the son somewhere in between. What it means is that that's going to make everyone a nice, happy, smiley family on the outside, and inside there's going to be in the unconscious various modes of rebellion. In order to get past that rebellion, so that the rebellion doesn't destroy the structure, I'll just work on the Western family right now. The Western right family has to work through what's called a process of proper Oedipalization, where girls learn how to become good mothers, boys put aside the desire to take the father's place now at the age of 3, 5, and 6, because they know that at the age of 18, they'll take the father's place in another dynamic, But in the meantime, there's this pressure produces aggressivity. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
So if you and I have aggressivity with respect to the hydraulics of grammar, we can just go write a poem or sing a nonsensical song, or but if you have aggressivity due to the repressive apparatus of a nuclear family, and the distribution of power is unethical in the way that it is gendered, then there could be an internal combustion. Mm-hmm. And so that aggressivity that is typically it's experienced in all children, but let's just stay with the girl child, because it's typically experienced most severely in the girl child, needs a grounding wire, like an electrical grounding wire, and it needs a destination to take out the rage that it doesn't even know it has, but it feels that would otherwise be against the father, And what Fanon is saying is that the Black image, and then the Black person, is like an object that is always available for that. And so it can be an object that is available for a kind of aggressivity, and then the performance of that aggressivity can also at the same time produce a sense of elation. I'm crude here. That's why I want you to read the book. It's an orgasmic feeling that comes whipping somebody, an orgasmic feeling that can come from watching Tarzan and Jane massacre the natives, and that is the joy sauce, and the imago is the component of the property aspect of it, from the French word. Now, that's not uncommon. It happens all over the world. But the thing of it is that the Black formation has no people other than other Black people to perform that, to send that aggressivity to, and put it on in a violent or unethical way. So we're simply objects that look like and talk like subjects, who are objects available for as available as the destinations of aggressivity that can become joy in its performance. This is what makes the videos of Black people getting murdered a double-edged sword, because they also produce a sense of pleasure at the same time that they are dramatizing horror.
So it's that moment of anxious release, almost like the moment, almost like any other form of like uh, ways in which aggression is dispersed, whether like you're punching a pillow, but in this instance, it is a very nuanced and specific ritual for civil society that makes that necessary. Um, and so what's interesting to me is when you talk about that the paradigm that you describe in the second portion, when you write in this in the book, you write this part about vertigo, and in that section you say that the black self is at war with itself because it is torn between a projected hate towards the black imago and a love for the white ideal. And so I'm thinking about Saidiya Hartman's latest work, in which she talks about these communities of love and care that come out of waywardness. And I'm thinking about Christina Sharp's work about love that happens in the wake. And I'm thinking about Fred Moten's articulation of monin as a way of thinking about care and social life that spills out of the white gaze. And so I'm wondering if you think if this war in the imago that is happening within the Black intramural, if you think that that can be altered with care, and if you think that can be changed with social life, and if you think that that is a paradigm that can be altered with these articulations of love and community, or if you think that that is a necessary integral to the social life formation that allows the Black intramural to exist in the first place.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. So what is the, well, let me say what I think. And then maybe I didn't get the second part of, say the second question, if you would again.
You establish that the Black self is at war with the Black imago through this kind of love for the white ideal. And you describe this in your answer to the last question as this is a paradigm that is happening within Black communities, within the Black self, if I'm understanding you correctly. And so within these writers who are talking about love and care and these new epistemologies and these new possibilities for subjectivity that exist within moments of social life and care that happen in these different historical instances that happen now, I'm wondering if you read these as having the potential to alter this violent relationship in the psyche, and if not, you know, if it's constitutive to.
Well, I want to celebrate them as tactics and performance, but I want to be, so they need to happen, and they do something. But I'm cautious, and this is where I might differ from some of the writers that you mentioned. I'm not entirely sure. I'm cautious I would never say what they do, right? Because once you say what they do, that assumes something that I don't believe to be true, which is to say that you can think now about Blackness as different from what it is now. You can act now in a way that resists the pigeonholing of the imago, and those are, very important. And I started Wayward Lives, and then I gave it to a Black woman who needed it for her own, personal growth and what she was going through. And so I had to buy it again and get back to it. So let me not talk about that, right? But I don't believe. I think that in Hartman's scenes of section, what she argues is that merriment, stealing away, which is to say yourself as a piece of property, going to the next plantation to marry someone or just have fun, these are all playing an instrument, like Salman Northwood did, and dancing. These are all important episodes of social life and intramural conversation and relations, but they don't pierce the bubble of social death. And so this is part of the debate that you all might have seen between Sexton and Moten when Sexton wrote The Social Life of Social Death. I would call them provisional and important, but we can't really say that they're essential. And I would say, and I wouldn't, I'm talking to you and debaters who have read this stuff very thoroughly. This is not the kind of thing that I would say at a Black community center. For example, like subjectivity is an impossible destination for Blackness. That would be my argument, because subjectivity is, by its very nature, its first principles is that to be a subject is to be elaborated by the symbolic order first, and then to be disciplined by the violence of that order second. And so this is the actual inverse of Black elaboration is the actual inverse of that. We are elaborated and positioned by gratuitous violence, and then the words get piled on after that. And so if you're going to be very rigorous and precise, then subjectivity is the very antithesis of Blackness. There will be something else on the other side, but it won't be subjectivity. And I don't know what it will be. And it will only come into being when we have kind of cataclysmic revolution, which makes for the next day where there are no Blacks and no humans, and a different paradigm will come to existence. But I don't think anyone can imagine or write a sentence about what that would be, because thought is contained within the paradigm that from which it emerges.
That's really interesting to me, and that leads me to my next set of questions, specifically when we talk about these moves to the other side, as you articulated, the other side of where there is no subjectivity and there is no Blackness. One question that has been occupying everyone's minds within the last few weeks is this question of police brutality, and specifically regarding the responses to this violence. We talked about earlier the burning of the Minneapolis Police Department. I'm wondering how you, as an Afro-pessimist, read the Minneapolis City Council's move to dismantle the police, whatever that means in its execution. But that rhetorical statement, I think there's a portion in the book, or maybe it was in another interview I watched with you, where you said that dismantling the police, if I understand you correctly, you said that dismantling the police is a necessary measure. Police are killing Black folks in the moment. And I would agree with that. But I also recognize that there is a tension between this and these in civil society being terminally anti-Black. So I'm really curious as to how you read these steps in dismantling what present themselves as the state or violence within this context.
I don't have a point-for-point Pilgrim's Progress as to how that would come about. Because Afro-pessimism, to get back to your earlier statement, is a big ear trumpet. It's a listening device which hears Black speech in those moments when it is not beholden or concerned about its, here's the speech of Blackness right before death, in a sense. In other words, what would you say if, like, for example, George Jackson's last words, that's Afro-pessimism. It's like, if you speak as Black, you better be prepared to die. So what you do is you really don't speak as Black, you speak in a kind of qualitative, careful mode. And I can't say how you get from that to a change that I could actually say what it looks like, because because all the discourses that you are dealing with as debaters, whether you're running the post-colonial K or the Marxist K or the feminist K, just as rhetorical apparatus, they come with two gestures. One is the descriptive gesture, and one is the prescriptive gesture, which answers Lenin's question, what would be done, which is why lend themselves so nicely to debate tournaments. But Afro-Pessimism only comes with the description of Black suffering. It doesn't really come with a prescription or a vision of what that would look like on the other side, precisely because all of those other discourses have these subjects of oppression being those subjects after they're liberated, but liberated zone and liberated way. The emancipatory dream or possibility of Afro-Pessimism undoes, or there's no more Black and there's no more human. It's a total cataclysmic. There are sentient beings. What will it be? So that's part of it. The other part is that I'm kind of lying by omission when I say, because my speech is coarse, even though people think I speak freely, right? If I really, so this might be my last interview if I speak freely with you, okay? So, but what I'm really saying is, I'm not against police brutality, which is correct. I'm against the police, but you have to read that statement symptomatically, because what it really means is I'm against the country. And then if you read that symptomatically, it means I'm against the world. I'm against everyone's capacity to transform limitless space into nameable place. It's everyone's capacity to transform endless duration into the event. There's no other discourse that is that iconoclastic. It's the kind of spatialization that has its boot on the neck of the Indian. It's the kind of temporality that has its boot on the neck of the worker. It's not the end of the capacity spatialization. It's not the end of the capacity for the event that these subjugated entities are against. And so, it's really great that you asked me to read the passage, because we actually circle full back to my grandmother, right? The end of the world, not the end of certain construction of an unethical world, but the end of world-making capacity as we know it. And am I getting at all to what you're asking me?
I think it definitely helps a lot. It helps me a lot, because I think the articulation that stands out to me, and I think what you just articulated that really, really helps me a lot, is just what you said. You described this stance of Afro-pessimism as being the stance of the capacity to turn endless duration into an event, the capacity to turn space into town, into city. And so I think that what that makes me think of is, for me personally, I am for police abolition just as I am for geographical abolition, or just as I am for clock abolition, or just as that is all part of the movement of things that ought to be abolished if we are, abolishing the world as you describe it.
I want you for your folks to write down this woman named Taija, Taija McDougall, and you can probably find her on Facebook, and because she's writing a dissertation now in which she actually goes right to temporality. And what we never remember when we look at a clock is that 12 o'clock is a construction. There's no such thing as time. It's the violent incursion of discursive labor into endless duration. There's just duration, and then you make time, which is the event. And so very few people, she's writing a pessimist dissertation on this, and what she's finding is that conceptually, for the past 3 centuries, the conceptualization of temporality, meaning moments on the clock, are intertwined with the vocabulary of words like slave and slaveness. It's very, very fascinating.
What I'm curious to hear you talk about is how we move to the other side, if that is possible, if that movement is possible, and what that looks like for you, or how you envision that taking place?
Yeah, I think that I I would like to say something about that. I don't really know. I mean, like I'm the guy with the stethoscope. I'm doing the diagnostic. Um, I would look to, especially your age group, people like you, to answer the question about praxis and forward movement. You know, I mean, and I think that you should never trust a professor of any race who wants to tell you about revolutionary praxis. By the time we are part of the academy, especially if you're in it like 20 some years like me, we are such milquetoast, non-confrontational, in my case, neos, that we are worthless with respect to, you know, we get anxious when the energy is about to set it off, you know, and it really has to be set off. So it has to be set off. And this is what the young people in Minneapolis knew. So I look at that as that burning to the police station, not as a political process, but as a gesture I can celebrate that moves towards what I'm talking about. How it does, I don't know. But the only thing I do know that where that connects with Afro-Pessimism is that what we are saying is that the Black imagination needs to be set free. The Black imagination needs to be set free so that it does not have to answer to the constraints or the principles of the imagination of others. And that was a really important moment. I can't say what it looks like on the other side. I mean, even in paradigms that are based upon contingent violence, 400 years ago, I don't think any philosopher, any critical theorist, I mean, the intellectuals were ecclesiastics. They were members of the church. And they didn't, I don't think anyone could imagine that, whoa, Jack, in another 100 years, feudal peasants and lords as a thing that structures society will be kicked to the curb. We're going to have this new species called worker and capitalists. Um, it took the revolution to make the imagination to instantiate the new paradigm and bring about the new species. So what we'll say is that that kind of violence is the prerequisite to thought. People think, you know, Fanon and the Wretch of the Earth is like a warmonger and a terrorist. He's making a diagnosis. He's saying that structural change, which is not just in the infrastructure, but it's a change in how we think about ourselves and how we think about the world. Violence is a prerequisite to thought. You simply don't have a new world, which is a new categories, new ways of thinking, new ways of subjugation, new ways of living freely without a cataclysmic form of that undoes the old world. And this is precisely what so-called progressives who think that they're being radical when they use the word defund the police, as opposed to the phrase abolish the police. This is what they're suffering from, what Sexton calls the anxiety of antagonism. They this world is bad, but goddamn, if I get rid of, you know, what next? So let me tinker with it a little bit, you know, because I don't, you know, and as Cynthia Hartman told me when I was writing my dissertation, she was an intellectual brains on my committee, said no one wants to be as free as Black people will make them, because they'll be free of their culture, they'll be free of their language, they'll be free of their attachment to the land, they'll be free of their God, they'll be free. No one wants to be that free. We don't want to be that free, but it's imposed upon us as a form of, as someone with nothing in a world with people of varying degrees of something.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting, that idea of that other end of freedom as also being in a zone of frustration and violence as well. As we wrap up, I've got one final question for you. We've been talking a little bit about the debate community here and there, but one specific dialogue that's been happening a lot is this idea of non-Black debaters being able to pay large sums of money to Black folks to teach them Afro-Pessimism, and then them beating Black kids by calling them slaves and the whole, 9 yards. And so I'm wondering how you read these moments. You speak about it in the book a little bit towards the end. I'm wondering how you read that.
Well, you all might have heard of Patrice Douglas. I have a book out yet that we wrote a piece together in Black Scholar called The Metaphysics of Violence, Metaphysics of Presence, in a specialist ish Black scholar, which was about Black philosophy. She will have a book out in the next 5 years. She teaches at Duke. And she asked me in a graduate seminar when she was still doing coursework, well, how do we keep Afro-Pessimism Black? And it was a very shocking question, because at the moment I had to realize we can't. I would like to, but just as our bodies and our music doesn't belong to us, what Hartman is saying is that when you do make merriment on the plantation, or when you steal away to go to the next plantation to see a loved one, those are, moments of kind of the Black intramural, but they have not changed the general structure, which is to say that all what you do and all who you are simply extensions of the master's prerogative. And so it happens a lot more slowly in written as analytical writing, as we're talking about here. But you get some high-powered crackerjack intellectuals, debaters, and they're going to figure out a way to steal it, to mobilize it into something that is not about Black liberation. Just like white boys in the ghetto are more into hardcore rap. And in psychoanalytic terms, it's called to volatilize one's existence. Black music, I'm white, Black music turns me on more than white music, because it gives me this sense of release and joy songs, that can only come from the cultural enunciation of someone who has nothing. It's why Black people are used to energize rallies and multicultural political settings, as long as we don't talk about Black suffering in that setting. So I don't like it. I like using the first principles of Afro-Pessimism to run, using K from Afro-Pessimism to articulate some kind of suffering from another group. But the sad thing about it is that Afro-Pessimism belonged to them anyway, just like belonged to them. Now, it doesn't mean you have to sit back and take it. It doesn't mean that I have to sit and take it. In fact, Black debaters have, for the past 10 years, staged various staged revolts on plantation of debate, which I'm enthused and energized by.
Thank you so much for that. That really gives a certain level of clarity that I think is really useful. The very, very last thing before we have to take off that I'd like to know is what gives you hope?
I don't know. I hope to die violently. I'm joking, but I'm kind of serious. I hope that in my 80s I can have some money and live on an island somewhere and go swimming a lot. I'd be lying if I said it was more conceptually coherent than that. Because no, what I'm trying to do is just not look at things like what's happening, because I know that I'm going to have to look at them, like the murders of people who are Black and things like that, because I know I'm going to have to look at them to write. And so, we're constantly bombarded with what Fanon and called the cultural imposition into the Black psyche. And so avoiding that is a large part of my daily praxis. I wasn't like that when I was years through my 30s and part of my 40s. I kind of winding down, and I'm physically less able to. Time when I wasn't afraid of having a fist fight with somebody. Now I am. It's that kind of thing. I have hope in the exponential proliferation of joy and rage that comes from people like you in your age. That gives me hope.
That's really beautiful. I really appreciate that. My guest this evening has been Dr. Frank Wilderson. His new book, Afro-Pessimism, blends critical theory and memoir for a truly special piece of writing. Afro-Pessimism is published by Liverite Publishing, and it is available everywhere now. Thank you so much for joining. It's really been a pleasure getting to talk to you.
Right, Quinn. We can meet in person one day.